Eleanor, thank you very much indeed, and thanks for the How To Academy for partnering on this. As she said, this is the culmination, in a sense, of a day in which we've launched CoJiT UK, Combating Jihadist Terror in the United Kingdom. This is the cherry on the cake for us. We've spent the day at the Royal Institute. We had quite a big meeting yesterday amongst the 30-odd specialists that we brought together as the first stage of the CoJiT initiative. You can read, some of you will have the outline that you can pick up outside, so you can read much more about that out there. But I know that you're here tonight, as it were, to hear a little bit about CoJiT, but mainly to hear our two speakers. And I should say that because of what we're dealing with and the sensitivity of all of this, that the first part of our meeting, the more formal presentations, are on the record. So everything that is said for the next 15 minutes or so is on the record. But when we get to the conversational piece and the audience participation, then we are strictly off the record. All right? So let me just repeat that. We're on the record for the formal presentations. We are off the record for everything else that is said after that. And I'll remind you of that fact later on. So let me just begin by introducing our two speakers. First to speak will be Ed Husain. Ed will be known to many of you from his writing in the press and journals and his appearances on television. Ed's been on a journey. These days, reality TV stars always claim they've been on a journey, but Ed really has been on a real journey. He was a former radical Islamist, and he wrote a remarkable book, which you can get outside, called The Islamist, about his change of heart and the fact that he has moved to the position now where he's an advisor to governments and to think tanks and so on. He's a senior fellow at the Civitas Institute in London. He's a visiting senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Centre in Washington, D.C. And he's also just produced The House of Islam. And this is a very courageous, hard-hitting book. It's very controversial. I guess he's probably earned a torrent of abuse for it, as well as great plaudits. But it's a very good book, and I would recommend it to you. And Ed, afterwards, will be available to sign copies and talk about it in the reception area if people are interested. And then on my far right is Lord Evans of Weardale, Jonathan Evans. He was the Director General of the Security Service from 2007 till 2013. He is a classicist by education, which I guess is a good education for anything, really. And he joined the Security Service, MI5, in 1980. In the late 80s, by the late 80s, he was dealing with terrorism. First domestic terrorism and then international terrorism. And he has basically seen it all through Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, the 9/11 attacks in 2001, right through to jihadist terror as a result of the last few years. And in his role as Director of the Security Service from 2007 to 13, he was at the very pinnacle of dealing with domestic terrorism in the United Kingdom. Now, as Lord Evans of Weardale, he is also a visiting professor at St Andrews, and I'm proud to say, my old institution, he is a senior visiting fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. I'm very pleased about that. So, in the formal part of the evening, I'm going to ask Ed, first of all, to speak for 7 to 10 minutes, principally about the way in which his book, The House of Islam, his sense of where the world of Islam is, how this reflects in our society. And then I'm going to ask Jonathan to, again, speak on the record, just in terms of the sort of terror challenges which he has faced, and the terror challenges as he sees them in relation to Britain, and the ways in which I think he may see them changing. So let's start by asking Ed to just give us a few minutes, Ed, on your sense of the world of Islam as it applies to the United Kingdom at the moment.
Michael, thank you, and thank you to all of you for being here. I'm always indebted to people who have a wider intellectual bandwidth beyond Brexit and Donald Trump. So the fact that you're here indicates that you're of that very rare category of people, so thank you for being here tonight. It's a real honor and privilege to be on stage with Lord Evans. It's worth noting that when I was in New York and Washington, D.C., people would speak highly of you, and in that American spirit, I say to you, thank you very much for your service, sir. You know? Now, where are we on combating jihadist terrorism and extremism, and how does that play out with who we are in the West? It's worth just, I'll say two things. One is that let's face some uncomfortable truths from the very beginning of this conversation, because too often we think extremism and terrorism is the result of perhaps poverty, unemployment, or foreign policy grievances. Well, let me ask you questions and just reflect on them in your own mind. If it's about poverty, then perhaps the poorest Muslims and others in the world would be in either Ethiopia or Mauritania. So why do we not have a widespread extremism and terrorism problem in either Ethiopia, its immediate neighborhood, or in sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, ask yourselves that question if it's about poverty. If it's about unemployment and racism here in the UK, well, the most unemployed here are the white working class. So why is it that we don't have sections of white working class people blowing themselves up, or trying to at least? I mean, if it's about racism, then perhaps people from India or from the West Indies or from Nigeria, I mean, they also are here in large numbers, in addition to Muslims, who face the same problems vis-a-vis racism. Why is it that people from the Caribbean islands or people from Nigeria who are Christians aren't, or a section of them, not becoming suicide bombers? If it's about grievances, I put to you the most aggrieved people on earth must be the Jewish people. Whether it's the Holocaust in the last century, or whether it's going back to antiquity and the persecution of Jewish people under Roman times, or going further back under Egyptian and Pharaonic times. So why is it that among Jewish people we're not seeing that outburst, even in a small minority of people who want to become extremists and terrorists? Because at the core of what drives Islamist extremism, jihadist terrorism, is a grand project. And yes, the Prime Minister is right to condemn the terrorism. And yes, our politicians are right to say that that the terrorism must stop. But how we end this is by uprooting the idea, the call for a caliphate. And at the end of the First World War, the Russians lost their empire, the Germans or the Austro-Hungarian Empire failed. So Christendom as a project ended. Well, the Ottomans also lost an empire. And we often forget that the German loss led to Nazism, the Russian loss led to the Bolshevik uprising, and a century of communism. But the loss of the Ottoman Empire also gave us a form of a totalitarian movement. That movement is Islamism, and the call of that movement is the call for a caliphate. Attacks in Britain are because Britain is seen as an obstacle to the caliphate. Attacks on Britain is to destroy what they call the grey zone of coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims. It's not an accident that the Ariana Grande concert is attacked, or Westminster is attacked, and so on. So the first point on how we stop the extremism and its outcome, the terrorism, is by realizing that there is a strategic aim that drives the terrorism, and that aim is a call for a caliphate. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the most recent reincarnation of a caliphate, called exactly for more attacks on the West because he saw himself as a caliph. So every time the caliphate project emerges and is destroyed, incidentally by Muslims in this instance, it's worth remembering that there is more and more terrorism. So now 100,000 or so fighters disseminated from previously what was ISIS-controlled territory. Some of them are in our midst, some of them are in the Middle East. So we have to understand and accept in the how-to project that it's by uprooting that call for a caliphate that extremists say is a religious obligation on Muslims, that unless we reject that totalitarian ideology and that religious obligation, the terrorism won't end. And on this first point, I just finished by saying that their call for a Sharia or a Sharia state, as in Sharia is enforced by law, it's worth remembering that the most mainstream Muslim scholars going back 1,000 years have said that whichever society has these 5 things is already a Sharia-compliant society. So it's Imam Juwaini, teacher of Imam Ghazali, all the way down to our time with Abdullah bin Bayya. Any society that protects the family, religion, the intellect, provides security for its citizens, and upholds private property is already a Sharia-compliant society. So I've got news for you, the Tommy Robinsons and others out there. Britain is already a Sharia-compliant society. Now, we don't need Sharia in Britain because Muslims are free and others are free to observe their religious duties. But we're not in China, so if you want to go and fight jihad, go to China. This is not the place for jihad. And my second point and my final point is this, that the reason why extremists and terrorists and jihadists and Islamists, Salafi jihadists, whatever we wish to call them, are thriving on our university campuses, active on our websites, out there on our streets and in community centers on Saturday mornings, calling people to their radical ideology, filling up mosques increasingly with worshippers, as well as on Friday at the minbar or the pulpit, is because we've lost something here in the West. I, for example, could live in China for 50 years or in Nigeria for 50 years. I would not become Nigerian or Chinese. There's something very special here in the West, which is the culmination of 2,000 years of history. I think it was in the year 212 when the Roman emperor then awarded everyone citizenship. It's that old Roman idea that you can absorb ideas and values and become a Westerner. You can become a Roman in the classical term. But in today's age, you embrace the open society, you embrace freedom, gender equality, racial equality, the rule of law, and you become a Westerner by virtue of doing that. Now, that idea, that ideal, and the confidence to become a Westerner and then assert Western values, as Senator McCain used to say, that we are the last best hope for humanity. It's having that confidence that what we have, what we've built, is much better than what the supporters of a caliphate offer. And unless we have that confidence in our own intellectual history, our own recent history, and learn from the past, and know that we are the inheritors of Socrates, of Cicero, of Jesus, of Moses, of Muhammad, all of those great figures helped shape the modern West for what it is today. And anyone who's propagating a totalitarian mindset, be it the far left, far right, or Islamists, we will say no to that. And thus far, and I'll finish on this, thus far we haven't had the confidence of our convictions to say no to Islamist extremists, be they on campuses or elsewhere, for fear of being racist or Islamophobes and whatnot. And too often we forget that whatever you want to point to the history of the West, I put to you that my friends in Turkey are guilty of equal amount of slavery and castrating black people and put them up as a eunuch in the harem of the Ottoman Empire, or our Arab friends have a long history of slavery, or even my Indian cousins have a long history of the caste system that's still active. So let's not flagellate ourselves excessively in the West and allow for a cleavage to emerge that then allows for extremist Islamists to operate. So on the how-to front, be more confident as to who we are, and say no to every manifestation of the ideology of the caliphate.
Ed, thank you very much. You never disappoint. Thank you. Right, let me go straight to Lord Evans of Weardale. Jonathan.
Thank you very much. And just to return Ed's compliment, I would like to say that his book, The Islamist, I would say is one of the most important books that's come out in the last 20 years in getting people to understand what this is about. And I say that because if you talk to politicians and so on, certainly in the early days after 9/11, people were saying, what is all this about? And you get sort of theoretical answers and you get sort of academic answers. But the story of a real person in Britain going through that process is what I think made it real to a lot of people and made that sort of, it's the way into understanding what this is and how it applies. So I think it's, apart from being a really good read, I think it's a really important book in terms of its influence. I wasn't paid to say that, but what I want to say is a little bit about the way in which the UK as a country has tried to counter the threats emanating from jihadist ideology and violent jihadism. And this really dates back for about 20 years. So it was before 9/11 that the security authorities started worrying about the emergence of Al-Qaeda. It's, of course, now about 18 years since the first attempted attack in the UK, which took place about a year before 9/11, a guy called Moinul Abedin in Birmingham, creating a very large amount of homemade explosives. So any suggestion that this is a problem created by the invasion of Afghanistan or the invasion of Iraq is completely ahistorical. It was an issue before that, including in the UK. And the UK government has been focused on this issue now as a really important public policy issue for about sort of 17 years or so. And the strategy that they've adopted and that we have adopted as a country to try to counter this is called CoNTEST, the Government Counter-Terrorism Strategy. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I saw that at its birth and I was involved in trying to implement some of the strategy and it still continues. And the very fact that CoNTEST is still a major plank of government policy in itself demonstrates that this is a problem that we have not managed to get on top of, because if we had been successful, then we wouldn't need a counter-terrorism strategy, but we certainly do. So what has the problem been? There are 4 elements to contest. They all begin with a P. 3 of them, I think, we've actually made really strong progress on. It's not perfection, but it's pretty good. And I would, amongst those, I would say the prepare element, which is to say, as a country, we need to be able, in the event of an attack, to respond appropriately to it, to have available to us the means to take care of the injured, to manage our own response to it, all those sort of things which take a lot of planning. That works well. I think the UK has a good system for responding to crises such as terrorism, and we're not the only ones. I thought, in fact, whatever the background to the attacks in France, one of the really impressive things to me, looking at it with a professional eye, was the way in which the French responded to the Paris attacks and the resources they were able to get out on the streets and so on, genuinely impressive. But that takes planning. So I think there's been good progress on that strand of contest. The second strand I would talk about is protect, and that means as a country we rely on our critical infrastructure, our water system, our transport system, our banking system, etc., etc. And if we're going to maintain national life as we live it, we need to protect those systems, those critical infrastructure assets. And the protect strand of terrorism has focused on that. And again, I think in general, we can see really good progress. One very clear example of that was the guy a couple of weeks ago who tried to drive a vehicle into the car park at the Palace of Westminster, and he collided with a barrier, and the car stopped and the barrier didn't move. That is not accidental. That is as a result of proper policy. It's as a result of proper guidance for engineers on the engineering requirements and implementing those in the vulnerable sites around the country. I walked past the site the other day, and the barrier appears to be exactly the same one that was there before. It's got a bit of scratching on, but basically the car was wrecked and the barrier was fine. That's not very exciting, and it's not very kind of, sneaky, but it's a very, very good way of reducing our vulnerability to terrorism so that it doesn't hit us as hard as it could. The third strand of contest is the pursue strand, which is the exciting one in one sense, and that is, how do we track down the terrorists, find out what they're doing, and stop them? And certainly when I was in MI5, that was obviously a major part of our effort. And the UK has traditionally invested quite heavily in pursue capabilities because of the terrorist threats that we have had. And I think the resources that have been put into that over the last 20 years have paid off. We aren't able to stop everything. But if you look at the number of attempted attacks compared with the number of attacks that have actually resulted in death and destruction, then there is quite a good story there. And I would say that the 2 key elements of that are, first of all, integration of effort, ensuring across the whole UK community, security community, that we are all facing in the same direction and we have the same priorities. Those of you who've been watching Bodyguard, I was talking about it to Bernard Hogan-Howe, who was the Met Commissioner, and said it's a good thing that we didn't have the relationship that is portrayed in Bodyguard between the police and MI5. And of course we don't. Actually, the UK is extraordinarily integrated in the way that we counter these threats, at working across barriers and working internationally. And the other is digitization, that the power of data, appropriately authorized under law and used accountably, has been enormously important in helping us to get ahead of the terrorists, stop their planning, and most of the time, although tragically not all of the time, safeguard members of the public. So those are 3 Ps where I think we can point to a pretty good track record. The 4th P is prevent, and this bears on the issues that Ed was talking about, because this is how do you actually stop members of our community, members of our society being attracted into violent extremism, jihadi extremism, and wanting to become terrorists. For all the reasons that Ed has said, it's not self-evident that this is a good choice. It's a bad choice, so how do we stop people taking those bad choices? And I think this is a real challenge for a Western government. And certainly if you go back to the 1990s, there was nothing happening in the government to promote particular forms of belief, to challenge extremism, and to engage in this sort of public discussion of values. It just wasn't the sort of thing that governments did at that point. So there has been a massive turning of a supertanker to recognise that government, public institutions have to engage in this battle of values, and it's not something that is comfortable and comes readily. If you look at the challenges in, for instance, helping the education system to take on board their responsibilities in respect of individuals who might be attracted to extremism, that was very difficult. Educators don't want to be seen to be acting as spooks or enforcement officers, and they didn't feel capable of, or that it was their responsibility to go down in that direction. Although I think the analogy of safeguarding that says if you have a young person who is at risk of sexual exploitation, then there are good systems in the schools to identify and stop that. And it seems to me it's exactly the same issue in terms of young people who are being seduced into pathways and activities that will be very damaging to them, and we have to have that responsibility. Now, Prevent has not been a failure. There have been many successes, and I was pleased to see the Security Minister yesterday saying that he was going to produce more data on the successes of Prevent, but it remains contested territory for a variety of reasons, and I think some of those who are arguing against Prevent do so for dishonourable reasons, as well as some who argue against it for honourable reasons, but also it's just slow and difficult for a government to do. So that's where I think we have been. Very quickly, 2 points on where do I think we're going. At the moment, we are at another sort of juncture in the road. Where are the members of IS who have been a threat to us in the last 4 or 5 years going to go next? We have seen the influence of them and that particular grouping in the attacks in this country and the propaganda and the media efforts that they make, and that has led to death and destruction on our streets. Will that continue? Or will that be a declining problem in the way that, to some extent, Al-Qaeda was a declining problem? We don't know, and that seems to me to be a juncture. The other thing I'd say is cyber attack has so far not really been a terrorist issue. And that is a dog that hasn't barked, and I don't know why. Because it seems to me, if one is looking to attack the functioning of society, then potentially cyber terrorism is one of the ways in which you could do that. And therefore, I think we need to be very focused on the possibility that terrorism will reach into that domain. And one final point, of course, this is not the only terrorist threat the UK faces, and there is a rise in terrorist intent and action on the far right, and the proscription of national action, the neo-Nazi group with terrorist aspirations, I think is a demonstration that we, as a society, have an extremism problem which does extend beyond one particular ideology and touches on others. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Can I just take up, while we're still on the record, the Prevent strand of the contest strategy? It's the hardest of the four in a way, and it's not been particularly well understood, but it hasn't been very well presented, has it, over the years? Or not presented well enough, put it that way.
No, I think that's right. I don't think it's been well articulated. I don't think the successes have been made visible, and the critics of it have had a lot of opportunity to paint it in the wrong colours, in my view, and the government has not been good enough at explaining what this is, what this isn't, and the progress that has been made. And as a result of that, it has been said that the brand of Prevent is toxic. I don't know whether that's the case, but it's certainly very much contested territory.
And on the question of protection, you mentioned London. I guess the way you point to the fact that you can see barriers in London, but there's an awful lot of counter-terrorism in London that nobody ever sees. London is unique. No city is secure, but London is uniquely secure among European cities because there's the tip of an iceberg, and the iceberg is pretty big, isn't it, that the public would never see.
There is a huge amount of activity going on the whole time on counter-terrorism, and the aim, of course, is that nobody should, the whole aim of the contest strategy is citizen-centric. It's that people should be able to go about their business in security and confidence, not worrying about this, violent extremism, which I think is a very sensible way of articulating a national security aim, because this is not about obscure and strange strategic aims of the state. This is about people getting on with their lives in safety. And in order to do that, there is a massive amount of activity, not just in London, but elsewhere in the UK. And of course, because the UK has been challenged by terrorism for longer, actually, than a number of other countries, because we had the Irish Republican problems for a generation before that, we've developed ways of going about counter-terrorism, in which we were probably ahead of many of the Europeans, because they didn't actually have that problem as pressing as we do.
Do you worry that there's another wave of terrorism out there which is building at the moment, or over the next couple of years?
I think the question of what happens with IS is important. Al-Qaeda hasn't entirely gone away. It's interesting that the nature of the attacks has changed quite a lot, certainly since I was in MI5, because during the period after 9/11 and right up really to 2012, the ambition, particularly of Al-Qaeda, was to do great, big, complicated attacks to rival 9/11. And whilst, had they been successful, they would have been catastrophic, it does mean that there's quite a lot of attack surface for an intelligence agency. The problem that we have today is almost the low level of ambition of get a car, drive it into the crowd. It's less catastrophic unless you are immediately involved, where it's appalling. But of course, it's very difficult for an intelligence capability to spot whether a particular individual hiring a car in his mind has that intent. So it's different, but it's equally challenging to stop.
Thank you. And Ed, just coming back to a couple of things that you said, you talked about the caliphate as this unifying idea that you can't be a good young Muslim in many areas in the United Kingdom unless you say you believe in the caliphate. That's relatively recent, isn't it, in the dialogue as a requirement, as it were? And does it link in with a rather sudden loss of confidence in the Western world? Do you see those two things as somehow related?
Yes, I do. And just before I answer the question directly, I want to say that much of what Lord Evans has said is absolutely vital, but often when it reaches the stage of government reacting and responding, it's almost too late. You do a sterling job, but the responsibility is really with all of us. And by all of us, I mean that John Locke's concept of the robust civil society. And that's why it's brilliant to see Kevin Maxwell and his brother put this kind of event on and support an initiative that philanthropists are behind and civil society is being convened, because it's our country and these are our communities and it's for us to debate and discuss, and government should be the last resort, and too often it's been the first resort. And I think it's that emptiness in society at large that makes the proposition of a caliphate attractive to young Muslims in parts of London, as it was to me in my teenage years, Bradford, Keighley. I was in York on Monday, in parts of Dewsbury, and all across Europe, because the narrative is that you as a Muslim don't belong in the West. There's a war against Islam launched by the West from the times of the Crusades downwards or onwards, and it's a religious duty to recreate a caliphate, and it was destroyed in 1924 by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British and the French. And unless that caliphate is recreated, every ordinary Muslim has a sin on their neck. That's an Arabic expression, but every Muslim is sinful. Now, you're absolutely right, Mike. That was not the narrative among ordinary mainstream Muslims. And, we forget too often that many Indian Muslims fought side by side with Britain against Turkey in the First World War, in their millions, because Muslims didn't recognize this caliphate vis-a-vis the Ottomans. They had their own notions of Muslim leadership in India. So what's happened is that because of the emptiness and the moral vacuum in the West and the lack of clarity as to who we are, why was I allowed to, as a teenager in Tower Hamlets College, to have a separate prayer room inside the college campus when literally within 2 minutes walk there was a mainstream community mosque? Because for me, the mosque wasn't good enough. I needed to mobilize and organize, but my liberal teachers were quite content to allow for us to have our kind of organizing space, because they thought, Karl Marx agitated, we in the 60s agitated against capitalism in the West, and what's wrong with a bit of Islamism on our campus? And I'm afraid that mindset still exists on our university campuses, that we're too tolerant.
Youthful exuberance, and it will go away.
It will go away, yeah. But sadly, in Exhibit A, it did go away. Perhaps there's some truth to it. But in many cases, it doesn't go away, and the risk is that when it doesn't go away, what it leads to. So I think there's a fundamental connection between our own lack of confidence, especially in Europe, as to who we are and why we are who we are, and that vacuum being exploited by a young generation of extremist Islamists.
Is that lack of confidence, does it trace back to Afghanistan and Iraq, or were they just symptoms of something else that was more deeply problematical within Western society at the end of the Cold War?
I think, when Nietzsche, it's interesting, he said God is love over at the back. When Nietzsche declared God is dead, he was articulating something, that we'd done something here in Europe. And then I think Oswald Spengler wrote that book at the height of the First World War about the decline of the West. Now, we've been talking about the decline of the West since Cicero, by the way. So this has been a 2,000-year-old conversation. We're always declining. And we never quite decline. And we've just got to realize that we've come to a point in history here in the West that with all of our flaws and weaknesses, and we have many, we have perfected in many ways what people around the world want. And the evidence for that is in the hottest days of Cairo. Go and look at the embassy queue outside the British embassy, or the American embassy, or the German or the Spanish embassy, or the French. People want to come here because there's something very special here. So inside, we take these things for granted, that you can wake up in the morning, go to work. When I come home late at night, my daughters and my wife are safe. We take that for granted, and we shouldn't, because around the world, that's what people are aspiring towards. So, I would put it much... I think something happened in the trenches of the First World War, the Battle of the Somme in particular, when people came back, young men came back, and they couldn't go back to church, because there was... if there was God, how could that have happened? And rather than have that conversation about the moral foundations on which the West is built, the Judeo-Christian civilization, as well as the Greek heritage that we've all benefited from, rather than have that conversation as to what is the space of a theistic humanism, whatever you wish to call it, we've completely discarded God and religion from the public domain. That then allows for extremists to say, in a religiously illiterate society, this is the way God wants you to behave. Here it is in black and white in Scripture, and that allows for the literalists and extremists to then advance their ideology. So, the way forward has got to be for us to rediscover who we are, both in our Judeo-Christian tradition as well as our Greek tradition. And when we assert that, we find, interestingly, that there isn't, I as a Muslim can be fully Muslim and fully Western, because, I don't want to do a long philosophy lecture here, but, Aquinas benefited immensely from Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who benefited from Ibn Tufayl. The initial Muslim civilization for the first 500 years bequeathed Aristotelian thought to the West that led to the Enlightenment. It's not an accident that Kant, in his dissertation, starts it with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Now think about that, in the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, in Arabic. So there's a Muslim presence in European thought that we should celebrate, which not only allows for historical openness and honesty, but it also allows for young Muslims to feel that the West is theirs too, that we are not outsiders, that this civilization is also ours because we helped contribute to creating it, and we helped prevent its decline at its most pivotal moments, and we've helped, in this country at least, fight for Queen and country for 2 world wars. So if anyone has a right to be here, we have every right to be here. But that's the narrative we should be pushing in our schools and universities, rather than being on the defensive and saying, oh yes, we're very sorry about everything we did. Because there's nothing that Britain did in the West, in the world historically, that the Turks didn't do or the Arabs didn't do. So let's kind of bring an end to the flagellation and have a little bit more confidence.
Okay, thank you. Where but in the How To Academy could you get philosophy and policy linked together in such an interesting way? Okay.